Okay, this next bit of multiplication is one that most people are pretty familiar with. So I'm going to try and give it to you in a weird way first, and then we'll go and talk about it in the FOIL method way. I do want you to understand that what we're talking about whenever we are multiplying together two polynomials, whether or not we've got a monomial times a monomial, a binomial times a binomial, or like we had in the last video, a binomial times some other polynomial, we're using the distributive property, maybe in different forms, but we are using the distributive property. And as an example right here, let's say if I had 7x minus 3 times 5x minus 6. I know that if I were to distribute some number times, let's say, 5x minus 6, by the distributive property, what I would have to do is I would have to multiply a times 5x and a times 6 in order to use my distributive property. Well, it's going to work the same way here, only this time instead of a, let's take it to be 7x minus 3 times 5x minus 6. Okay, let me set my pen with here. Okay, so how's that going to work? Well, in this distributive property, instead of having a times 5x, we would be taking 7x minus 3 times 5x. And instead of having minus a times 6, we would be having 7x minus 3 times 6. And by a distributive property, we would take these guys and distribute them into each of these parentheses individually. So you see what's going to happen. We're going to end up with something that looks more like 5x times 7x, which is 35x squared. We're going to have 5x times minus 3, so that's going to be minus 15x here. We're going to have 6 times 7, which is negative 42x. And we're going to have negative 6 times negative 3, but remember this negative also plays a role. So this is going to be plus 18 constant, right? And then when we add these together, we would get 35x squared. Negative 15 minus 42 is the same thing as saying negative 57x and plus 18 at the end. Now you look at that and you go, wow, that seemed like a really complicated kind of thing just to get this 7x minus 3 into each of these terms. I remember learning it differently in high school. Well, you probably did. You use something called the FOIL method. And all the FOIL method is a way of memorizing this result right here without having to go through extra step of distribution and then another extra step of distribution. We have to take these one at a time. So what's going to happen right here is that we're going to take term by term each of the terms in each binomial and distribute them to each term in the second binomial. So this is where this comes from. First refers to the very first terms in each binomial, right? So you can think of this as, well, we're just going to take 7x, and we're going to ignore the rest of the bits that we have in here. And we're going to take 5x, and we're going to ignore the rest of the bits that we have in this second binomial, right? So our first term would be 35x squared. When we say O, that stands for outer, and of course that means we're taking 7x, we're ignoring the rest of the bits in this one, and we're taking negative 6 from this binomial. See what I'm saying here? I'm just ignoring this 5x that was here. And all we're doing is we're taking the outer term. So 7x times negative 6, and that's going to be our negative 42x x to the first. Inner terms means that we're taking the two inside terms from our binomial. So we're going to ignore this first term this time. We're going to take negative 3 here from the first binomial and 5x from the second binomial and multiply them together. So in this case, that is like saying negative 15x. And of course, L stands for last term, so that means we're just going to take the last term from each binomial. That's a negative 3 here and a negative 6 here, and multiply those guys together to give us positive 18. All right, almost gave away points on that one. So now what would have to happen is that we're going to add these things together. And guess what? We have exactly the same problem. 35x squared minus 42x minus 15x plus 18. And when we add those guys together, our like terms gives us 35x squared minus 57x plus 18. That's the answer we were looking for. So this one, even though I wrote it out sort of the longish way up here, should give you an idea of what we mean by FOIL. It's really just a method for remembering distribution. Well, let's do it this one. Let's take our example and multiply 8y plus 7z times 3y minus 4z. Everything works the same way. This time we can line it up horizontally rather than having to go side by side like this longish thing. That's going to take up a lot of room on the paper. But our first terms are 8y and 3y, and that's 24y squared when those are multiplied first. Our outer terms are 8y times negative 4z. So outer terms, it's going to be minus, positive times a negative is minus, 8y times 4z. 8 times 4 is 32. Y times z is our next terms. I is that 7, our inner terms right here, so 7z is multiplied by 3y, so this is plus 7 times 3, 21 times y times z. And finally, positive 7y, our last terms, right, our positive 7z is multiplied by negative 4z, so that's positive times a negative minus 7 times 4, 28. Z times z gives us z squared. So when we add together our like terms, negative 32 plus 21, we're going to get 24y squared minus 11 times y times z minus 28 z squared as the result. There's a few problems here at the bottom. I'll pause for a minute and allow you to write those down, and I'll put my answers in the next video.